Look, I need to tell you something that nobody else will have the courage to say. Right now, at this exact moment, there are millions of married men around the world who wake up every single day next to someone they promise to love forever. And the first thought that crosses their mind is a simple, devastating question. What have I done? They won't admit it out loud. They can't. Society has built an entire fortress of expectations, traditions, and moral codes around marriage, making it almost impossible for a man to confess the truth without being labeled as a failure, a coward, or worse. But here's what they won't tell you in those romantic movies, in those wedding speeches, in those Instagram posts showing the perfect couple smiling at the camera. Marriage, for most men, becomes a prison. Not immediately. Not in the first months when everything still carries that new relationship energy. But eventually, slowly, like a python squeezing its prey, it tightens around their freedom, their identity, their very essence until they can barely recognize the person they used to be. And the most brilliant philosopher who ever dared to speak this forbidden truth was Arthur Schopenhauer. While everyone else was celebrating marriage as the ultimate achievement of human existence, Schopenhauer looked at it with cold, unforgiving eyes and said what nobody wanted to hear. Marriage is fundamentally a trap designed by nature to ensure reproduction, disguised as romantic love to make men willingly walk into their own captivity. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another bitter rant against relationships, stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal to you goes far deeper than simple cynicism. This is about understanding the biological mechanisms, the social programming, and the psychological warfare that has convinced generation after generation of men to sacrifice their autonomy on the altar of matrimony. And whether you're single, married, or somewhere in between, this knowledge will fundamentally change how you see relationships, commitment, and what society tells you that you should want. Schopenhauer understood something that modern relationship experts desperately try to hide. He understood that romantic love, that overwhelming feeling that makes a man believe he cannot live without a particular woman, is not some magical spiritual connection. It's a biological con job. Nature doesn't care about your happiness. Nature doesn't care about your fulfillment. Nature has exactly one priority: making sure you reproduce and pass on your genes. And to accomplish that goal, nature had to engineer a mechanism so powerful that it would override your rational thinking, your survival instincts, and your natural desire for freedom. That mechanism is what we call romantic love. Think about it logically for just a moment. When a man falls in love, what actually happens to him? His judgment becomes clouded. He starts making decisions that his rational mind would never approve. He overlooks red flags that would be obvious to any outside observer. He makes promises about forever, when he has absolutely no way of knowing what he will want, who he will be, or how he will feel 10, 20, 30 years from now. He essentially signs a contract in a state of temporary insanity, and then spends the rest of his life being held accountable for commitments he made when he was chemically intoxicated by hormones and neurotransmitters designed specifically to shut down his critical thinking. Schopenhauer called this the genius of the species working through the individual. The species needs you to reproduce. You, as an individual, might have other plans. You might want freedom, adventure, variety, the ability to pursue your own interests without answering to anyone. But the species doesn't care what you want. So it floods your brain with chemicals that make one particular woman seem like the answer to every question you've ever had, the solution to every problem, the missing piece that will finally make you complete. By the way, I'm curious, what city are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments because I want to know where in the world men are finally waking up to these truths. Here's where it gets really dark. The moment you get married, the moment you sign that legal contract and stand in front of all your friends and family making those vows, something shifts. Not immediately, not overnight, but gradually, systematically, the very qualities that made you attractive in the first place start to become liabilities. Your independence? Now it's selfishness. Your ambition? Now it's neglect. Your need for solitude and personal space? Now it's emotional unavailability. The frame inverts. During courtship, you were the prize. You were the one being evaluated, yes, but you also had the power to walk away at any moment. You had options. You had freedom. You had leverage. After marriage, especially after children enter the picture, that leverage evaporates. Now you're locked in. Now walking away means financial devastation, social shame, separation from your children, and being labeled as the villain in a story where you thought you were the hero. Schopenhauer observed this pattern over and over again in the marriages around him. Men who had been vibrant, ambitious, full of life and passion, slowly transforming into hollow shells, going through the motions, performing the role of husband because that's what was expected, but having lost that essential spark that made them who they were. And the cruelest part, society tells these men that if they're unhappy, it's their fault. They're not trying hard enough. They're not being good enough partners. They need to be more romantic, more attentive, more available, more accommodating. The message is always the same. Sacrifice more of yourself, give up more of your identity, suppress more of your natural instincts, and maybe then you'll find happiness in marriage. But Schopenhauer asked a question that nobody else dared to ask. What if the institution itself is fundamentally incompatible with male happiness? What if marriage, by its very nature, requires men to betray their own essence? Not because they're bad at relationships or because they chose the wrong partner, but because the structure of lifelong monogamous commitment runs counter to some of the deepest biological and psychological realities of male existence. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds extreme. This sounds like giving up on love, on connection, on building something meaningful with another person. But that's not what this is about. This is about seeing clearly. This is about understanding the game you're being asked to play before you commit your entire life to it. Because once you understand the mechanisms at work, once you see how nature manipulates your emotions and how society exploits your programming, you can make actual choices instead of just following the script everyone else follows. Let me tell you what happens to most married men, the pattern that Schopenhauer identified, and that remains absolutely true today. In the beginning, there's passion, there's excitement, there's the thrill of conquest, the satisfaction of having won a desirable woman's affection and commitment. This phase can last months, sometimes even a few years. The sex is good, the companionship feels fulfilling, the future seems bright with possibilities. But then gradually, things start to change. The sex becomes less frequent. The woman who used to greet you with enthusiasm now barely looks up from her phone when you walk in the door. The conversations that used to flow effortlessly now feel like work, like obligations you have to fulfill. The spontaneity disappears, replaced by routines and schedules and an endless list of responsibilities. And here's the thing that nobody warns you about. The more you do, the less appreciated you become. You work harder to provide a better lifestyle. That becomes the baseline expectation. You help more around the house. That becomes your job, not something worthy of recognition. You try to be more emotionally available. Your vulnerability gets used against you in future arguments. It's a game you cannot win because the game is designed to extract maximum value from you while giving you just enough scraps of affection to keep you playing. Schopenhauer saw this clearly. He saw how marriage transforms a relationship of mutual desire into a relationship of mutual obligation. And obligation, no matter how you dress it up, is the death of passion. When you're obligated to spend time with someone, that time loses its value. When you're obligated to be faithful, faithfulness loses its meaning. When you're obligated to love, love becomes impossible. Because real love, real desire, real connection can only exist in freedom. The moment you remove freedom, the moment you say this is permanent, this is forever, you're locked in with no escape. Something essential dies, and both people feel it, even if neither one wants to acknowledge it. The wife feels it in the way her husband's eyes linger a little too long on other women. The husband feels it in the growing list of resentments his wife carries, the way she keeps score of every perceived slight, every moment he failed to meet her expectations. They become roommates who occasionally have obligatory sex, business partners managing a household, co-parents coordinating schedules. Everything except what they started as, which was two people who genuinely desired each other's company, with no compulsion, no contract, no force except mutual attraction. Now here's what makes this especially insidious. Society has created an entire industry around saving marriages, around teaching men how to be better husbands, around convincing everyone that if your marriage is failing, you just need to try harder, communicate better, be more present. But all of this advice is built on a false premise. It assumes that the problem is in the execution, not in the fundamental structure. It's like telling someone their cage is uncomfortable and they need to redecorate it, while completely ignoring that they're in a cage at all. Schopenhauer would look at modern marriage counseling and laugh at the absurdity. You're telling a man who has lost his freedom, his identity, his sense of purpose, that he needs to work on his communication skills. You're telling him that the problem is he doesn't do enough date nights or buy enough flowers. This is missing the forest for the trees at a almost comical level. The problem isn't that he's bad at being married. The problem is that being married requires him to be someone he's not. It requires him to suppress his natural instincts, to pretend that he wants things he doesn't want, to perform a role that society has written for him regardless of whether it fits who he actually is. And every day, he wakes up and puts on that costume and plays that part, and a little bit more of his authentic self dies. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he talked about the tragedy of marriage. Not that it's difficult, not that it requires work, but that it requires the fundamental betrayal of your own nature, and calls that betrayal maturity, growth, love. Think about what society actually celebrates in a husband: sacrifice, selflessness, putting his wife's needs before his own, giving up his dreams for his family, working a job he hates to provide a lifestyle he didn't choose. These are the qualities of a good husband according to the dominant narrative. But notice what all of these have in common. They all require him to make himself smaller, to want less, to be less, to systematically dismantle his own identity and reconstruct it around someone else's expectations. And if he resists this, if he insists on maintaining his own interests, his own friendships, his own goals separate from the marriage, he's selfish, he's immature, he's not ready for commitment. The message is clear and consistent. Your value as a man is measured by how much of yourself you're willing to destroy for others. Now, Schopenhauer didn't say all of this because he hated women. That's the easy dismissal, the lazy critique. He said it because he valued truth over comfort, reality over pleasant illusions. He looked at the institution of marriage honestly and saw it for what it actually is, stripped of all the romantic mythology. And what he saw was a social structure designed primarily to benefit women and children at the expense of male freedom and happiness, disguised as a mutual partnership that would fulfill both parties. The economics of traditional marriage make this obvious. The man provides resources, stability, protection, and social status. The woman provides sexual access, domestic labor, and children. But in the modern world, this exchange has become fundamentally imbalanced. Women can provide for themselves financially. They have their own careers, their own resources, their own social status. They don't need a husband for survival anymore. But men? Men still give up the same things they always gave up when they get married. They still surrender their freedom, their options, their ability to pursue variety and novelty. They still take on the primary financial responsibility in most relationships. They still sacrifice their individual goals for family goals. So what exactly are they getting in return that they couldn't get without marriage? Companionship? You can have that without signing a legal contract. Sex? You can have that without promising forever. Children? That one's more complicated. But let's be honest, in the modern legal system, having children often gives men responsibilities without rights, obligations without authority. The more you actually analyze what marriage offers men versus what it costs them, the more irrational the whole arrangement appears. And that's exactly what Schopenhauer was trying to get you to see. That marriage persists not because it serves men's interests, but because it serves nature's interest in reproduction and society's interest in stable family units, regardless of what it does to individual male happiness. You're being asked to sacrifice yourself for an abstraction, for the species, for society, for tradition, while being told that this sacrifice is actually what you really want deep down. It's one of the most successful cons in human history. Millions of men every year voluntarily entering into contracts that will statistically make them less happy, less healthy, more stressed, and more restricted, all while believing they're doing it for love. And here's perhaps the most painful truth of all. The women married men thought they wanted, the women they shaped themselves into pretzels trying to please, often don't even respect them for it. Because at a deep primal level that bypasses all social conditioning, Women are attracted to masculine independence, to strength, to men who have their own mission and purpose beyond the relationship. The very qualities that make you a good husband according to society's definition, the accommodating, the compromising, the constantly available, the endlessly patient qualities, these are the same qualities that kill attraction. You cannot negotiate desire. You cannot accommodate your way into passion. The more you try to make yourself into what you think she wants, the less she actually wants you. This is the cruel paradox at the heart of modern marriage. Following all the advice, doing everything right according to the marriage manual, actively destroys the very attraction that made the marriage possible in the first place. Schopenhauer understood that this contradiction isn't a bug in the system, it's the system itself. Marriage was never designed to maximize attraction or passion between partners. It was designed to create stability for raising children and organizing society. The happiness of the individuals involved, especially the man, was always secondary to these larger structural goals. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. Every piece of marriage advice, every cultural narrative about what makes a good husband, every expectation placed on married men, they all start to look like tools of social control rather than pathways to fulfillment. Society needs men to get married, to have children, to work stable jobs, to be predictable and manageable. Free men, men without obligations, men who answer to nobody but themselves. These men are dangerous to the social order. They might pursue their own interests instead of generating tax revenue. They might question traditions instead of perpetuating them. They might inspire other men to choose freedom over security. So society has spent thousands of years developing increasingly sophisticated methods of convincing men that their own captivity is actually their liberation, that giving up everything that makes them who they are is actually how they become their best selves. And the truly diabolical brilliance of it all is that they've convinced men to police each other. If you're a man who questions marriage, other married men will be the first to attack you. Not because they found some secret to marital happiness that you're too blind to see, but because your freedom threatens the story they've told themselves about their own choices. Your existence as a free, happy, unmarried man is a living reminder of the path they didn't take, the life they gave up, the person they used to be before they accepted the deal. This is why married men are often the most aggressive defenders of marriage, even when their own marriages are clearly making them miserable. They need to believe the sacrifice was worth it. They need to believe there was no alternative. Because if they admitted the truth, if they acknowledged that they could have had a different life, a freer life, a life more aligned with their actual nature, the regret would be unbearable. Schopenhauer saw these men everywhere in his time, and they're even more common now. Men who have convinced themselves that their quiet desperation is actually contentment. Men who have redefined happiness to mean the absence of conflict rather than the presence of joy. Men who measure their success by how well they've managed to suppress their own desires rather than how fully they've lived. These men will tell you that marriage is wonderful. They'll post pictures on social media showing their perfect families. They'll give speeches at weddings about the beauty of commitment. But watch their eyes when they see a young, single man living freely. Watch how quickly that smile fades. Watch the mix of envy and resentment that flashes across their face before they bury it under another layer of rationalization. That look tells you everything you need to know about whether they actually believe what they're saying. The truth leaks out in 1,000 small ways. The jokes about the old ball and chain. The wistful comments about life before kids. The way they live vicariously through single friends. The sudden interest in hobbies that take them away from home. The long hours at work that aren't really necessary. These aren't random quirks. They're symptoms of a deeper malaise. The psychic cost of spending every day pretending to be someone you're not. And the tragedy is that most of these men don't even fully realize what's happened to them. The change occurred so gradually, so incrementally, that they never noticed the person they used to be slowly disappearing. One small compromise at a time. One boundary crossed at a time. One piece of their identity sacrificed at a time. Until one day they wake up and barely recognize themselves in the mirror, and they don't even understand why they feel so empty. Schopenhauer would tell you that this emptiness is not a personal failing. It's not because you married the wrong person, or because you're not trying hard enough. It's the natural result of living in fundamental contradiction to your own nature. You're a biological organism designed for variety, for novelty, for freedom of movement and action, trying to force yourself into a social construct designed for stability and predictability. Something has to give. And what gives is your vitality, your passion, your sense of aliveness. You trade it all for security, for social approval, for the comfort of knowing exactly what tomorrow will look like. And society tells you this is growing up. This is maturity. This is what responsible men do. But what if maturity isn't about accepting captivity? What if growing up doesn't mean killing the parts of yourself that want more, that dream bigger, that refuse to settle? What if the real maturity is having the courage to live authentically, even when it means going against everything society tells you that you should want? These are the questions Schopenhauer forces you to confront. And they're uncomfortable questions because answering them honestly might require you to admit things you don't want to admit, to see things you've been avoiding seeing, to make choices you've been too afraid to make. But here's what I need you to understand. Awareness is not the same as action. Understanding these truths doesn't mean you have to blow up your life. If you're married, this isn't permission to cheat or abandon your family. That's not what this is about. This is about seeing clearly, because only when you see clearly can you make conscious choices, rather than just following programming. Maybe you decide that despite everything, despite the costs, despite the sacrifices, marriage still aligns with your values, and you choose it consciously, not because society told you to, but because you've weighed the trade-offs and decided it's worth it for you. That's fine. That's a conscious choice made with full awareness. Or maybe you're single, and you've been feeling pressure to settle down, to find the one to start checking those boxes that everyone says you need to check. And now you're questioning whether that's actually what you want, or just what you've been programmed to want. That's exactly the question you should be asking. Or maybe you're married and you've been feeling this growing sense of dissatisfaction, this nagging feeling that something is wrong but you couldn't put your finger on what. And now, reading this, hearing Schopenhauer's words filtered through modern understanding, something clicks. You realize you're not crazy, you're not broken, you're not failing at marriage, you're succeeding at seeing the truth. What you do with that awareness is up to you, but at least now you know what you're looking at. You're not confused anymore about why you feel the way you feel. The fog has lifted, and that clarity, painful as it might be, is valuable beyond measure. Because living in confusion, living in the fog, constantly wondering why you're not happy when you're doing everything right, that's its own special kind of hell. At least with clarity, even painful clarity, you know where you stand. You can make decisions from a place of truth rather than illusion. Schopenhauer would tell you that most people spend their entire lives in that fog. They never question the narrative they've been fed. They never examine whether the path they're on actually leads where they want to go. They just follow the person in front of them, assuming that millions of people before them couldn't all be wrong. But they can be wrong. They have been wrong about countless things throughout history. Entire civilizations have built themselves on false premises and marched confidently toward their own destruction. The fact that something is traditional, that it's what everyone does, that it's always been this way, none of that makes it true or right or beneficial for you as an individual. And marriage is one of those traditions that has persisted long after the conditions that made it necessary have disappeared. We don't live in a world anymore where people need to marry young to survive, where women need husbands for economic security, where sex outside of marriage is practically impossible, where divorce is unthinkable. All of those constraints have loosened or disappeared entirely. And yet the institution continues, powered primarily by momentum and social pressure rather than actual rational analysis of whether it serves people's interests. This is what Schopenhauer was rebelling against, the tyranny of tradition, the unexamined assumption that what worked for previous generations must work for you, that the life script written by people who lived in completely different circumstances must be the right script for your life. He was saying, wake up, question everything. Don't accept at face value what society tells you that you want. Look at your actual experience. Look at the married men around you, and honestly assess whether they seem happier, more fulfilled, more alive than the unmarried men. Not what they say, what you can actually observe. And when you do that honest assessment, when you look without the rose-colored glasses of romantic mythology, what do you see? You see men who have traded their freedom for security, and discovered that security without freedom is just a comfortable prison. You see men who have achieved everything society told them to achieve and found that the achievement feels hollow. You see men going through the motions, performing the role, doing what's expected, and wondering why it all feels so empty. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because Schopenhauer didn't just criticize marriage, he explained why it's so hard to resist. He understood that you're not just fighting against social pressure when you resist marriage. You're fighting against billions of years of evolutionary programming. Your genes want to reproduce. That's their entire purpose. They don't care if you're happy. They don't care if you're fulfilled. They just want to make copies of themselves. And they've engineered you with this incredibly powerful drive, this overwhelming urge that makes you willing to do almost anything to pursue sexual opportunities. That drive is what makes a young man stay up all night talking to a girl, spend money he doesn't have taking her on dates, rearrange his entire life to accommodate her schedule. His genes are running the show, and they're very good at making him think his own happiness is tied to pursuing this particular reproductive opportunity. And the genius of it, the truly diabolical genius, is that this drive is strongest precisely when you're least equipped to make rational long-term decisions. When you're young, when you're full of testosterone, when you're intoxicated by attraction and possibility, that's when the drive to pair bond is most intense. That's when you're most vulnerable to making permanent commitments based on temporary emotions. By the time you're old enough, experienced enough, wise enough to actually evaluate whether marriage serves your interests, you're often already locked in. Already have the wife, the kids, the mortgage, the entire infrastructure of a life built on decisions you made when you were essentially a different person. Schopenhauer saw this pattern repeat endlessly. Men making life-altering commitments in their 20s based on feelings they had in their early 20s, then spending their 30s, 40s, 50s living with the consequences of decisions made by someone who no longer exists. The person you were at 25 is not the person you are at 45. Your values change. Your priorities change. What you find attractive changes. Who you are fundamentally changes. But the commitment remains. The contract is binding. You're expected to honor promises made by a version of yourself that has been dead for decades. And this is considered reasonable. This is considered the foundation of a stable society. That you should be held accountable forever for decisions you made when you were barely an adult, when you were high on neurochemicals specifically designed to impair your judgment. If that sounds insane, that's because it is insane. But it's an insanity so normalized, so deeply embedded in the cultural fabric, that pointing it out makes you sound like the crazy one. This is the power of social conditioning. It can make the absurd seem reasonable and the reasonable seem absurd. It can convince you that freedom is loneliness and captivity is love. It can take your natural instincts and twist them into shame, take your legitimate desires and pathologize them as immaturity. And the mechanism it uses is other people's judgment. Because humans are social creatures, we're wired to care what other people think of us. We're wired to want belonging, acceptance, approval from our group. And society exploits this wiring ruthlessly. It makes conformity the price of acceptance, makes traditional life choices the cost of being considered a real adult, a real man, a responsible member of society. Step outside those boundaries and watch how quickly the judgment comes. Watch how quickly you go from being a person with agency, making your own choices, to being someone who needs to explain themselves, justify themselves, defend their life against an endless inquisition of people who think they know better than you what you should want. Schopenhauer faced this constantly. People demanding to know why he never married, as if his life choices were their business, as if he owed them an explanation for not following their script. And his answer was simple: because I value my freedom and my peace of mind more than I value social approval. Because I'd rather be alone and authentic than partnered and pretending. Because I refuse to sacrifice my essential nature on the altar of tradition. That answer enraged people then, and it enrages people now. Because it implies that the choice they made, the sacrifice they accepted, might not have been necessary. It implies that there was an alternative, that they could have chosen differently. And for someone who has spent decades convincing themselves that they had no choice, that marriage was inevitable, that this was just what adults do, that implication is intolerable. This is why unmarried men, especially unmarried men who seem happy and fulfilled, face such hostility from married people. Their existence is a threat to the narrative. They're living proof that the sacrifice wasn't necessary, that you can have a meaningful life without following the traditional script, that freedom and solitude might actually be preferable to partnership and compromise for some people. Society cannot allow that idea to spread, because if too many men figure out that marriage is optional, that they can have sex, companionship, and purpose without signing a lifetime contract, the whole system starts to break down. So the pressure continues, the shaming continues, the narrative that unmarried men are somehow incomplete, somehow failing at life, somehow not real adults. That narrative gets reinforced from every direction. But here's what Schopenhauer would want you to know. Their judgment says nothing about you and everything about them. When someone attacks you for not being married, they're not actually concerned about your happiness. They're concerned about the cognitive dissonance your freedom creates for them. They need you to be miserable so they can feel better about their own choices. They need you to eventually cave and get married so they can believe that everyone eventually comes around to seeing that marriage is the right path. Your happiness as a free man is a personal threat to their psychological equilibrium. And rather than question their own choices, rather than consider that maybe they made a mistake, it's much easier to attack you, to pathologize your choice, to insist that you'll change your mind, you'll see, you'll regret it, just wait. But what if you don't? What if you live your entire life on your own terms, pursuing your own interests, answering to nobody but yourself, and you die happy, fulfilled, with no regrets about the path not taken? What does that do to their narrative? It destroys it completely. And they know it. Deep down they know it. That's why they fight so hard to pull you into their world. Not for your benefit, but for theirs. Now let's talk about what Schopenhauer observed about what happens after the initial passion fades in a marriage. Because this is where it gets really dark. He noticed that once the biological purpose has been served, once children have been produced, or the reproductive window has closed, the entire dynamic of the relationship shifts. The thing that brought you together, that intense attraction, that overwhelming desire, it was never really about you and her as individuals. It was about genetic compatibility, about creating offspring with the best possible combination of traits. Once that purpose is fulfilled or becomes impossible, nature has no more use for the attraction between you. The chemicals stop flowing, the rose-colored glasses come off, and suddenly you're looking at this person you've legally bound yourself to, this person you've promised to spend the rest of your life with, and you're seeing them clearly for the first time. And what you often see is a stranger, someone whose values don't actually align with yours, someone whose goals conflict with yours, someone whose personality grates on you in 1,000 small ways that you never noticed before because you were too intoxicated by attraction to notice. But now you notice. Now you notice everything, and they notice everything about you too. All those little quirks that seemed endearing during courtship now seem annoying. All those differences that seemed exciting now seem like fundamental incompatibilities. All those compromises you were willing to make when you were high on love now seem like unbearable sacrifices. This is the reality of long-term marriage that nobody talks about honestly. The person you marry doesn't stay the person you married. You don't stay the person you were. And the legal contract you signed doesn't have an escape clause for we grew into incompatible people. You're stuck. You can try to make it work. You can go to therapy. You can read the books and listen to the podcasts and implement the strategies. But all of that is just different ways of trying to force compatibility between two people who might be fundamentally incompatible, trying to resurrect attraction that died for biological reasons beyond anyone's control. Schopenhauer saw countless marriages continue for decades after any genuine affection between the partners had died, held together purely by social expectations, financial entanglement, and concern for children. The husband and wife barely speaking to each other except about logistics, sleeping in separate rooms, living essentially separate lives under the same roof, and everyone pretending this is normal, this is fine, this is just what marriage becomes. But it's not fine. It's a slow death of the spirit. It's waking up every day next to someone you have nothing in common with anymore, and pretending you're still a team. It's performing affection you don't feel for an audience that doesn't even care. It's running out the clock on your one life, waiting for release that only comes through death or the catastrophic disruption of divorce. And the cruelest part is that society gives you no sympathy for this suffering. You made your choice. You made your commitment. Now honor it. Your unhappiness is your own fault for not trying hard enough, for not being grateful enough, for not accepting that this is just what marriage is. The message is always the same. Your suffering is not valid. Your desire for freedom is not legitimate. Your unhappiness is a character flaw that you need to fix, rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. This is the psychological torture of a dead marriage. Not the dramatic fights or the obvious betrayals, but the quiet erosion of your will to live. The gradual acceptance that this is it, this is your life, and wanting anything different makes you the problem. Schopenhauer had deep compassion for men caught in this trap. He understood that they weren't weak or failures. They were victims of a system that had manipulated them into making an irreversible choice before they had the wisdom to understand what they were choosing. And he wanted to warn younger men, to give them the clarity he wished he'd had, to help them see through the romantic mythology before they made the same mistake. That's what this entire examination is about. Not bitterness, not hatred of women or relationships, but clear-eyed analysis of an institution that promises everything and delivers something completely different. Marriage markets itself as the path to lifelong companionship, passionate love, deep partnership, and ultimate fulfillment. What it actually delivers for most men is obligation without passion, partnership without respect, companionship without genuine connection, and the slow realization that you traded your freedom for a fantasy that was never going to become reality. Now here's what I need you to understand clearly. This isn't about women being bad or relationships being impossible. Individual women are not the enemy here. The institution is the problem. The expectation is the problem. The social structure that takes something beautiful and spontaneous like genuine attraction and connection and tries to freeze it in place forever through legal contracts and social pressure. That's the problem. Some marriages work. Some couples genuinely grow together, maintain attraction, build something meaningful that lasts. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. And even in the best marriages, there's a cost. There's always a cost. Freedom given up. Options foreclosed. Individual identity partially surrendered for couple identity. The question is whether that cost is worth it for what you receive in return. And Schopenhauer's argument is that for most men, honestly evaluated, the math doesn't add up. What you give up is concrete and certain. What you gain is uncertain and often turns out to be far less than promised. You're gambling your entire life, your freedom, your happiness, on the hope that this one person will remain compatible with you, will continue to desire you, will not change in ways that make the relationship unbearable. And you're making that bet at exactly the moment when you're least capable of evaluating the odds rationally, because you're drunk on neurochemicals designed to make you take that bet regardless of the actual probabilities. This is not a fair game. The deck is stacked against you from the start, and Schopenhauer wanted you to know that before you sit down at the table. He wanted you to count the cost before you pay the price, because once you're in, once you've signed the contract and the children arrive and the years accumulate, getting out becomes almost impossible. The financial cost of divorce can destroy you. The social cost can isolate you. The emotional cost of separation from your children can break you. You become trapped not by bars and walls, but by the accumulated weight of obligations and expectations, and the sheer difficulty of starting over. So you stay. You endure. You tell yourself it's for the kids, for stability, because divorce would be worse. And maybe that's even true. Maybe divorce would be worse, but that doesn't make the marriage good. It just makes it less bad than the alternative you can imagine. And Schopenhauer would tell you that this is not victory. This is not success. This is just different flavors of defeat. The defeat of staying in a marriage that makes you miserable versus the defeat of blowing up your life through divorce. Either way, you lose. The only winning move was not to play in the first place. Now, I know some of you are angry right now. I know some of you are formulating your objections, your exceptions, your personal anecdotes about how your marriage is different. And maybe it is. But before you dismiss everything I've said, ask yourself one question. Am I rejecting this because it's actually wrong? Or am I rejecting it because accepting it would require me to face uncomfortable truths about my own life? Because that's the real test. Can you sit with these ideas even when they're uncomfortable? Can you examine your own situation honestly, even when that examination might reveal things you don't want to see? Can you separate what you actually feel from what you've been told you should feel? Most people can't. Most people will reject uncomfortable truths in favor of comfortable lies, because the truth requires change, and change is terrifying. But if you're still here, if you're still listening, then maybe you're different. Maybe you're someone who values truth over comfort. Maybe you're someone brave enough to see clearly even when clarity is painful. And if that's you, then you understand what Schopenhauer was really offering. Not cynicism, not bitterness, but liberation through awareness. The freedom that comes from seeing the game clearly enough that you can choose whether to play. The power that comes from understanding the forces that shape your desires so you can distinguish between what you actually want and what you've been programmed to want. This is the gift of philosophical clarity. It doesn't make your life easier. It doesn't provide simple answers, but it gives you the tools to make conscious choices rather than just following scripts written by people who don't have your best interests at heart. And in a world that constantly tries to manipulate you, to program you, to channel you into predetermined paths that serve society's interests rather than yours, that clarity is the most valuable thing you can possess. So here's what I want you to do. Before this video ends, I want you to make a decision. Not about marriage, not about your relationship status, but about whether you're going to continue living on autopilot, following the script, doing what's expected, or whether you're going to wake up and start making conscious choices based on clear seeing rather than social programming. Because that's the real choice Schopenhauer is offering you. Not married versus single, but conscious versus unconscious, aware versus asleep, free versus programmed. And whichever path you choose, at least you'll be choosing with your eyes open. You'll know what you're doing and why. You'll own your decision instead of just drifting into it because that's what everyone else does. That's all anyone can really ask for. Not perfect choices, not guaranteed outcomes, just the clarity to see what's actually in front of you and the courage to respond authentically. Everything I've laid out here, every uncomfortable truth, every challenge to conventional wisdom, it all comes down to one simple principle that Schopenhauer spent his life trying to communicate. Your life belongs to you, not to society's expectations, not to tradition, not to what your parents want or your friends think or your culture demands. You get one life, one chance to be yourself, one opportunity to pursue what actually fulfills you rather than what you're supposed to pursue. And marriage, for many men, represents the end of that opportunity. The moment when they stop living for themselves and start living for everyone else's expectations. The moment when their life stops being their own and becomes a performance for an audience that will never be satisfied no matter how well you perform. Is that really what you want? Is that really worth the price? Only you can answer that. But at least now you're asking the question. At least now you're examining rather than just accepting. And that's where everything begins to change. Drop a comment right now telling me this. The truth always wins. Because that's what this is about. Not winning arguments, not proving points, but honoring truth even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew. The men who understand what I've shared today, the men who really get what Schopenhauer was trying to communicate, they're part of something important. They're part of a growing awareness that the old scripts don't work anymore, that the traditional paths don't lead where they promise, that maybe it's time to write new stories about what a good life looks like for men. And when you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, you're joining that conversation. You're saying you want more truth even when truth is challenging. You're choosing awareness over comfort. Hit subscribe now because the next video will shatter another illusion you've been living with. Another carefully constructed lie that society has convinced you to accept. Another piece of the matrix that needs to be exposed so you can see reality clearly. You won't want to miss it. Trust me.